security is saying, would you please sign up ahead of time? If you can do, if you show up now, it's no problem. I don't have a problem with it at all. However, make sure you sign in so that they have evidence. Something
Yes, and sometimes we get rental requests and they say, do you really need the community room for Dave Schlepper? And I'm like, yes, don't take it away. So
we've been doing it for 7 years, so you
this is why. Please sign up, it's free, and like I said, just even if you don't know if you're coming, just you can call the front desk. Anyway. Yeah.
Otherwise, and if you don't, one way or the other, just make sure you sign in your name on there, right?
Yes.
So
Yes. And if you're not in our system, just put your address so we can put you in the system. We don't sell any information or anything. For those of you that come, you know we don't protect the information. So don't worry about, you know, we sometimes have people that don't want to give us their information, but we don't give it out to anyone. Even if someone would come and say, Mary, can you tell me someone's address? I say no. But give them your information and call them. So.
Oh, that's,
yeah, but Dave is so popular, and we want to give him a raise because he doesn't get paid to do this.
Okay.
Thank you.
And just so you know, we have the thing is up here now. It's only in the one thing. The only problem is it blinks every so often here for some reason today. We can't figure out why.
No, and Dave is not going to look at
So I
that.
can't look
don't want any
because
issues.
I've had seizures before, and I don't want to have that.
No.
That make a fun, exciting place thing.
what happened to that one? Wasn't there one over there?
There used to be two.
Yeah.
We are, well, not me, but Community Center is in the process of getting new TVs. So there will be one big TV here, eventually. We thought it was going to come before they replaced ours. So, and obviously this TV is probably going out or something. We don't know, but
Yeah.
so I apologize for the blinking. But so everybody's just here to listen to Dave. So.
Okay,
right,
so our topic for today is weird and wonderful in early Shakopee. Really, if you pick anything, but I just like that picture, so I had to put that up. Just because it's, you find some weird pictures in the site, you know, in the Shakopee Heritage site. It has a lot of videos from the Huber collection, and some of them fun. This is just fun. This was a parade downtown. But as we start, I want to make sure that you understand that the land that we're on here is the land of the Dakota people. So we have to honor the gratitude of the land itself and the people who had stewarded it through the ages, including the Ojibwa and other indigenous nations. I think in Shakopee at the public school and the high school right now has about 20 different indigenous groups that are there.
That many.
Yeah. In fact, there's a big program there on Friday. Go and watch all kinds of stuff. All right. So the first one we're going to talk about is Martha. Her last name is Otherday. And Otherday is an important family group because if you look at the Otherdays, they lived not in Shakopee, but across the river, which is really Eden Prairie. But because they're so close together and they used to come here all the time, it was kind of, we always talk about over there is where the Indian encampment was for a long time. And so that was the Otherdays, and it was actually not a reservation, it was actually land that the Dakota bought that land, and that's why it's there. So this is related to the county fair in 1897. And Martha, I just like her picture. She looks fun. I bet
She looks fun.
I think so in some little way. Okay. So she was born around 1815 in Otherday, Minnesota. Her parents were Little Eagle War and Laughing at Iron Woman. Okay. But at one point, she married Jacob, Tatawaŋ Papa, Otherday. He was born in 1816.
Good luck pronouncing.
And so this is the reservation that was right across the river. If you look at where Memorial Park is now, and there's a crossing across the water there, right there to the right is where their land is, okay? Okay, so the 1857 census talks about Martha and Jacob. They lived on the north side of the Minnesota River. So technically, if we really want to talk about it, it's really Eden Prairie. But if you look at the signs, even this postcard, it says the Sioux Reservation, Shakopee, Minnesota. Well, it wasn't in Shakopee, it was Eden Prairie. And it wasn't a reservation, it was actually just land that the Dakota bought.
Oh.
But I do know a few people who are still around who remember going over to that where the land was.
Excuse me,
Yes.
was Eden Prairie even a place back then?
Yes.
It was.
Yeah. And there's a picture they have. There's a few pictures like this. This is so you can see. Here's Martha right here.
Still doesn't look fun.
Do you remember? Let me see. I think of who else. Do any other people remember any when you were young? Any Dakota who were living here? Minnie. Yeah, that's Minnie right up here. Yeah, people remember Minnie. A lot of people remember Minnie. You know that Minnie's great-grandson was the head of the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community for 8 years. And his great-great is the head of the museum there. And their last name starts with Otherday at one point. Okay. So anyway, they had them married. They got married at St. Mary's Catholic Church here in Shakopee. So there's a book called the Carver Story, Beyond the Village of Carver. And they talk a lot about that. In there, they talk about the Indian village at the Carver Fair in 1897. And then it says, the tum-tum sound of the beating drum rent the air and vibrated against and again in everybody's ears, while the haibai of male dancers mingled occasionally with the shrill tones uttered by the squaws, evidence throughout the village. Now, of course, they say squaw is not a word that we normally use. I'm just quoting from what it says. They said there are people,
What do
yes,
they call people now?
women,
Really?
Dakota woman. Anyway, you know, right. Okay. That was actually it was really cool for many years before that people who were indigenous people, often the women were called squaws, and it was kind of a way to demean them, really. So that's that's why they've taken away that. Like a lot of signs and stuff are all gone with that. So just so you know.
Yeah.
So yes, you just call them women. Okay. So again, this is, there are numerous people, including the Indians camp at Nightville, to see the inside of the teepee. Okay, and they can always come and they get it welcome to come in. And we have several other stories that we found of people remember going to the village and actually being invited into the teepees. They said the Indians, although they sound to be savage as ever, okay, but they were well educated and devoted members of the Catholic Church. Again, that use of savage is used a lot, so a lot of the newspapers also talk about anyone who was Dakota was savages. Well, again, not really the right thing to say, and hopefully people figure that out. Okay. Eventually, in 1911, Martha died. Okay. And that's just, she's a really interesting person to remember. The next thing we talk about is the, what we used to call the Spanish flu. Again, we can take away the Spanish really too, because that really didn't happen in Spain either. But anyway, it was from the 1918 to 1920. And you see this sign here where it says the Spanish flu. Okay?
Yeah.
It hit Shakopee on October of 1918. They said in 50 Scott County people and 1,200 Minnesotans died from the flu. We've had a very similar thing recently, right? Okay. It was called the Spanish flu because Spain, who was neutral in the war, was the first country to public reports of the cases. But actually, China, France, the United States had it, but they didn't want to use the name or talk about it in the newspaper. They didn't want people to really know. Some of the people who one of the victims from local was John and Teresa, and they had a newborn son. John and Teresa passed away within 12 hours of each other. John died first at 8:10 p.m. on Wednesday, and then Teresa died at 7 a.m. on my birthday, but in 1918. Just add the 1918. It was close, but anyway. And then, of course, they had a baby boy when she was born there, died right away. Okay, so in fact, when Teresa died, she never knew that her husband had also died. Ugh. What an awful thing, really, when you think about it. John was only 38 years old. Teresa was 33 years old.
Oh,
Lord.
Mary.
Okay. They had 3 children who basically lost both the mother and father. Teresa's parents were the John Fisher family of the community. Let's hope this goes through the whole thing. But this is what really interesting. They went to St. Mark's Catholic Church. So, like most, they didn't want them to go inside the church. Because if you did, they were afraid that people would get sick.
During that time frame.
Yeah. So only they had just a door there that they blessed them, and then they go to the cemetery quickly. Oh wait, don't stay, okay? And people were really afraid. They said that the father said the rosary across the road from the family's home. They wanted to pay their respect, but they didn't know what was happening, and they were worried that they would get the flu also.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Elizabeth Reese was also, who became the first mayor of Shakopee, woman mayor of Shakopee. She actually worked as a nurse during the flu. She said she worked days and nights. So during the month of the epidemic, there was in October 20th of 1918, they decided that they could have no schools were closed, and they said people were dying by the dozens. The next person who died was Martin Frank Dorn, who lived just north of town. Okay. The youngest man was just 17 years old. He had been ill for about 10 days, and later the influenza later went into spinal meningitis.
Oh.
In the Scott County Argus, they talk about it. They told the people in that, do not go and ask the doctor anything, okay? They're so busy right now, they couldn't do it. They said, just don't call them for minor cases. So that's really where the problem happened too. There just weren't enough doctors for it too. Of course, also, you have the homecoming of the people from World War I were here, and that is where they brought the flu here and then spread, okay? Not just in Shakopee, but all over the world, actually. People said that after World War I, that's when they brought it with them. Gordon, who was only 5 months old when he was sent to stay with relatives after his dad became ill. His father, who was a young Chaska baker, died from the flu. His mother was too sick herself to attend her husband's private funeral. And Gordon, of course, was an only child, spent most of his childhood living with relatives in Shakopee while his mother worked. Richard Zahn, a retired teacher, he remembers his father, Elmer, said that it felt like a normal flu. Richard and his 5 siblings all became sick. They didn't eat much other than raw eggs, which their mother fed them. Thank God it wasn't today. They'd be broke. They said that was the only remedy that they had. Just kind of interesting thing. It's also kind of interesting because it's tying with the pandemic here and the 1920 ones, you know. Both came from winged animals, birds and bats, respiratory virus. They had to wear masks in public. They had cities and schools to shut down. And people in the leaders in this place ignored their the signs. All right. So now the next thing we talk about is the gunman who went to the electric chair in 1937. This is kind of interesting. I actually found it because I found a book about him, this person, and what he was about, and apparently he was, a lot of it happened here in Shakopee. There was the First National Bank, and the bank there was on the north side of First Avenue, okay? Right next to Strunk Drugs, okay? In the same area, okay? So they said a lone, nervous, unmasked man walked into the First National Bank on January 25th, 1937. He had a dark overcoat and a light hat, tall, thin. He said he was twitching very nervously. He approaches the cashier's cage and asks Lucille Schwartz, the teller, for change. Okay? That's how it all happens. And there's the First National Bank there. Then the burglar suddenly pulled out an automatic pistol and demanded money. And this has happened a few times usually it's always on the First National Bank, so just FYI. I'm just kidding about that, but okay. So anyway, it's interesting because it said Lucille Schwartz, E.J. Huber, and assistant cashier Fred Weiland, I should say, the clerk, was told to lie down on the floor while the man entered the cage, gathered up the currency in the counter and the money drawer. Then the man took the gun, jabbed it in the back of Lucille's neck, and ordered her to open the inner vault. She couldn't. It had an automatic time lock. So he was upset, so he asked E.J. Huber to do it. Again, he said, well, we don't know what to do. We can't do it. Then the man waved his gun and shouted, I'll shoot. I'll shoot. And the cashier stepped into view. With a menacing swing of the gunman, aimed his pistol and again shouted, I'll shoot. Now at that point, you think you know, he's gonna shoot. Except part of it says, maybe not, because if you just keep saying that and never does it, maybe. I don't know, I just think about that. What would you do at that point? I think I would just fall down and say,
Yeah.
I'm dead, just go ahead. Okay. So while they were stood motionless, he slipped from the bank, ran to the car. Oops, sorry. There we go. Oops.
Oh.
Okay. He waited and then he took off. He had $4,671 and he went on the Lewis Street Bridge out of town. You know, that's going to be great for the newspaper because, boy, they know that's going to be a good story for a long time, okay? Now, what's interesting is that about a year and a half later, in the Shakopee Argus Tribune said, it turns out that the person who did it was John Henry Sieglum, I guess, okay? And according to the FBI, he says he was America's most cold-blooded and atrocious criminal. Okay, he was a bad person. And there's his picture. So it's fun because when you go to this, you can go online and just add this person on Google.com and it'll talk all about this person, okay? He was born in Wisconsin. He moved to Ironton, Minnesota. He was there and then tried to get a job during the Great Depression. His father died. It looks like his father died with carbon monoxide poisoning. They think that because of that, all this thing, plus he also met people from the Dillinger gang, pushed him towards committing crime. You always have an excuse. You have to figure what could be, right? So these things.
He learned how from them.
They said, when his father died, John tried to get to work in the iron mine. They told him there's nothing for him. Later, he sat around home for 2 years. He was desperate for money. And so he kidnapped Charles Herman Ross, hid in the shack in Emily, Minnesota. Okay? Eventually, they fell in the pit, fight for the gun. In the process, he wounded his accomplice, then he shot him again 8 times to finish him off. Ross suffered 3 skull fractures according to autopsy. And again, after he shot him all the time, he did one more at the head to make sure he was dead. They probably weren't very good with a gun if they had to keep shooting over and over again. But anyway.
Movie, though.
Right. So 3 months later, after the horse trade arrest, he led FBI to the frozen bodies and the hidden money near Walker, Minnesota. Okay. And so eventually he was executed in the electric chair on July 14th, 1938. He said the electricity, or the electric chair, it was actually 13 days prior to the first upon which he would have celebrated his 28th birthday.
Oh, man. Just a kid yet.
Yeah, exactly. So, and of course there is at Woodland Cemetery is actually his thing, beside next to his father. And there's, of course, this is the book where I actually read about him also. The book is not in print anymore, but it is kind of a cool book. All right, the next one we talk about is 1941. The first hospital in Shakopee. This was the one who was great for some people. It was the northeast corner of Home Street and 2nd Avenue. Dr. Fisher started the private hospital, and if you think of where it is, you know where Deco is downtown?
Yeah.
On Home Street and 2nd Avenue.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where actually was where the house was, which became the hospital. It was opened in 1915 and operated until 1937. It was the first of 4 hospitals in Shakopee, and Dr. Fisher was one of the persons who was there to start it. And there's the hospital, what it looked like, the information. This is what in the newspaper talking about the hospital. Excuse me. Eventually, when he was finished with it, Dr. Mellerich opened it. They said he was born in 1891, lived in Shakopee with his wife, Phyllis, 3 daughters, and a son, and a servant. And there's actually a picture there with the hospital that is in the middle. Now, meanwhile, so remember this concept. So it's 1938, 1939. Meanwhile, Albert Leclerc was born in Mendota. He's the first of 7 children. And that's his grandparents' names, if you are interested. He married Lily Felix in 1904 in Hastings. She was born in 1881. And again, they're all tied in. In fact, people who we know, for example, Ironwood, Rosalie Perrin lived here in downtown Shakopee for a long time. In fact, here's a picture of all of them. The bottom left is Iron Woman. Lily, like most people at that time, they took the young kids and put them in schools. So she was sent to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That's why we have the picture of that, because she was there, they take a picture. So eventually in Mendota, in the 1920s, they had first 3 children, Oliver, Celicia, I think it was, and Raymond in Mendota. And then at some point they moved just outside of Shakopee in 17 acres of land in 1919. That land is where Little Six Casino is in Shakopee.
Nice area.
Yeah, it was a nice area. Okay. Okay. So in other words, he was part of what until 1972, when the city of Prior Lake took over that reservation. But it became eventually the Shakopee, Metawakan, Dakota community. And of course now it's the Little Six Bingo Hut. But that's actually what it looked like back then. And people talked about that, and the family is interesting. They talk a lot about Lily had a pickle keg at the front farm outside the door. And the children would always dive in to get a pickle. And it's so funny because I just like the fact that people, what they remember, something that was so important that they read it, spent it down generation to generation. I'll remember the pickle jar, which is kind of interesting. Okay. And this is just the family here. So anyway, they were in what was the Little Six Casino area, right? The kids went to school in Shakopee, to St. Mark's School, okay? they said that the kids were also called half-breed and dirty Indians, okay? I remember one time they said they'd come home with cuts and bruises. So Lily went to the teacher to complain, and the person said they just need to toughen up. Now that wouldn't happen today, but anyway, it's interesting, right? I think she was a nun too, but I'm not going to be more specific with that. The name of it, but anyway, before my time. So eventually, Lily was sick of it, so she said, I'm moving back to Mendota with older children. So Albert stayed with Russell and stayed in farm. And while he was there, he asked for more land. He got a total of 40 acres, okay? Which is basically part now of the Shakopee Metawakan community. Because he had what was called a degree of Indian blood, so because of that, he was ended with the 40 acres of land for farming. But he wasn't really a great farmer, okay? In fact, he said, Lily, meanwhile, who moved over to Mendota, says a wonderful person. She was known because she used to be taking, all the kids were ready to get born. She would help them arrive into the world. In fact, she said, one person said that she remembers she was born breeched. She didn't breathe for a few minutes. So my grandmother hit me behind and then my back, and something flew out of me, and I started to cry. So everybody applauded, cried, laughed, hugged, and said prayers. It's also interesting because of that family in Mendota. She said when people, because it was the Depression time, people used to come to their tract in Mendota. They would knock on the door and ask for food. She'd give them a meal and they'd do work around the yard. She said they knew that her Lillian LeClaire as the angel of Mendota. You're pretty sure of a meal at her door. And that's always a nice thing to remember. I remember my great-grandma in Regal, Minnesota, and the same thing where they fed people all the time, so they know there's a place where they could put a thing to let other people know this is a good place to come if you need your food or whatever. She died in 1940 at the age of 58. But Albert was here in Shakopee at the what now is Prior Lake area, okay? He was there about 4 years later. He was thrown from a car that was overturned in the ditch near his farm, just outside of Shakopee, in 1941. They brought him here to the hospital here in Shakopee, which again is the Deco now, right?
Yeah.
And the doctor refused to treat him because he was an Indian. Okay. Bob Brown, who's the grandson, said, what kind of arrogance would lead someone into an emergency room to turn somebody away? His hip was protruding out of his side. He had a massive skull fracture. He said, it really pissed me off when I think about that. But the doctor said, well, look, he's Indian. He needs to go to Pipesville. That's where the Indian hospital was, by ambulance. That would be several hours away. And when he finally arrived in the hospital 1 week later, his father was still covered with dirt and blood.
Oh.
And of course, because of the delay in treatment, he passed away in Pipestone. The family shipped his body home. He was born in St. Peter's Cemetery in Mendota. And of course, the land in Shakopee lay fallow for years. He died, of course, in 1942. And of course, based partly on discrimination by the doctor in the first hospital in Shakopee. Now, of course, he was only there for a couple of years, and then he left himself, okay? And that time, that's where they became they moved over to, the area what was there then became, the same hospital was a hospital. It became the American Legion Club here in Shakopee. And then it was torn down. And then what was big there was the First National Bank. See, that First National Bank pops up in everything.
Yeah.
Okay. That was a different, that was one that was on North First Street on the north side. They moved it here. And of course, it was a very big, there's like newspaper articles when they got actually, when you could drive in and get your money, remember? That was a big thing back then. Okay. After the bank was moved, the building was torn down, turned into the third city hall. Now the city hall is over on, like closer to Marshall Road, whatever that area, okay? Okay. Then this building was torn down, and then it became the depot. Down below is a restaurant, and there's beer and pizza there too, and that's on Home Street. So you can go there after here for lunch if you want. It's not finished on this picture, but it's while it was being built there. And this was a big, everything here was a big controversy, you know, like people didn't want it there, and then other people wanted it, went back and forth, but it happened. Meanwhile, in terms of the hospital, the sisters, the Franciscan Sisters of the Blessed Virgin Mary of the Angels bought and remodeled the poorhouse, which is now a parking lot right near St. Mark's Church, okay? It had been, that building had been St. Gertrude's Academy, which was the first women's school, which eventually they ended up kicked out, and they moved to St. Joseph. And then they have what became St. What's the school? Benedictine, right. So they came here, they renovated the hospital, they had a chapel, rooms for the elderly on the second floor, and living quarters of the nuns on the first floor. Then right next door, they built, next to the poorhouse was the hospital that was built in 1953. That continued ongoing for a long time. I know my mom worked there, I remember. And then eventually it was opened, okay? It was torn down. It's now a parking lot. This is in 1996. And the new hospital was what we thought way out of town. So funny when you think of that now, and now it's like in the middle, you know, anyway, so that's the St. Francis Regional Medical Center. You just look at what changed over time. It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Now I want to talk about a few other persons. This person is really, Sheen Touch is her name. Born in 1927, died in 2022. Persevere, I said with that one. Okay, she was born in Cambodia. She was adopted and cared for by her aunt after her mother died when she was only 1 month old. She was one of the few people of her generation who was a girl who was allowed to read. She was 8 years old when she learned how to read. When she was 17 years old, she married. They worked at a banana farm in Cambodia. But even as they worked so hard, but basically they really got much money. In fact, at one point, trying to do a better life in 1958, they and their children went to a bigger town, and they sold water for a living. I don't think that's a great thing, money thing either, I don't think. Okay, they were hard workers. They continued to work. But eventually her husband passed away in 1970. So now she's got all her kids, and that's her. It got worse because of the area there in 1975 with the Cambodian Civil War. Of course, you've heard of or you've seen the movie The Killing Fields. If you don't, it's worth watching. It's a very interesting story of what that was like. But it was basically they killed people all the time, okay, because of Pol Pot, okay? They say between 1.5 to 2 million people, or about a quarter of Cambodia's population were killed. In fact, this is just a picture where this is this tree where people were killed through all the time and beat the children there. What a life. Okay, so meanwhile, Sean here is separated from her kids. Her older son was taken to be in the army, okay? She was separated from her 4 oldest sons. She was able to walk by foot for 15 days while she took care of her 2 younger children, a 12-year-old and a 6-year-old. Eventually, she met up with her second oldest son. Her son was disguised as to find it. Got in there, he ended up telling her that her son's wife and son went to America. And he said, you all need to go to America. That's what you got to do. And so they were in a refugee camp, and he eventually went to America. So she actually arrived in Minnesota in 1980. But her whole family was still not there. Some of them were still trapped in Cambodia. So they tried to learn English herself so she could pass her citizenship, because then she could sponsor her other children. So in July of 1987, she succeeded, and she was able to reunite with her remaining children in Shakopee. That's, I mean, what a life. I'm just like, this is too much for me, really, I think about it. But anyway.
If you walked far enough, would you be in free land?
Well, I think they went to like Cambodia, or Thailand, I think is where the refugee camp was, so right across
so
from
you'd
that
keep
area.
walking until you got to free stuff.
Hopefully, right. If you live for that.
Yeah.
So anyway, she died, she was 95 years old in 2022. She's buried at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis. So, just one you really think about in terms of what a thing. The next thing we talk about, of course, now switch a little bit now here. Here's the barbershop that collapsed in 1931. John Belts was born in Belgium, moved to Shakopee. They had 7 children, and he was a barbershop owner in downtown Shakopee. It was the first in Home Street, and at one point, they decided they need to widen the streets, okay, on First Avenue. So they condemned many of the properties, including his 1-story, 25-year-old brick building. It was on the northwest corner of the intersection, downtown, okay? So John decided, why don't I just take the building and move it to another place about 200 yards close to the other side. That was the plan. moving day arrived. They took several of the patrons as the building was slowly moved along the street. Suddenly, the barbershop collapsed in a cloud of dust.
Oh my God.
And there's actually pictures of that. So I think there's another one too. The east wall facing the Baron's store,
Yeah.
which is now H&R Block there. Right there, that east wall, which is facing the Baron's store, collapsed. It bowed wide, and then it was weakened, and then there was a loud crack, which caused all the workers who quickly got out of the building. Thank God. I mean, really. The deafening roar was to brought shopkeepers and pedestrians. So it's just interesting. It's also interesting because there's a lot of African Americans who are here too, which is kind of interesting. They said everything was down, okay? It was a wreck. One person said, we were just swinging the edge of her around when it happened. Boys yelled at me. I heard the crash and saw it go. And I forgot to plug in my thing, so hopefully it'll be okay. Okay. They had, remember they had asked, and the person said, I would move them as carefully as possible, but did not guarantee to place it intact upon the foundation. That was his excuse anyway, right? So anyone got out of the way, so that's good. And so eventually what did is John actually organized it, they cleaned up the area, and they set up a new building on his new site. Just an interesting story. But it's interesting because there's some great photos there.
Yeah.
Now here's John Bluestone and his wife, Anna. Notice how I just focus in on the ones I can't say. I can't say and I put the other parts. Okay, this is about the fish story in 1901. He was born in 1835, married Anna, and they moved to Eagle Creek, which is now part of Shakopee, started in 1856. The census says that they lived here, Eagle Creek, and the area said they were farming in Eagle Creek. So just so you know where we are. We keep moving because I want to. He did a lot of hunting, trapping, and fishing with his neighbor, who was Ed. And there's an article in the Minneapolis Journal in 1901 who talks about the person. And he talks about John Bluestone. As he's talking and they're interviewing him, and Ed says, well, you know, you've heard about the old Injun, John Bluestone, who used to be about these parts, I reckon. Of course, he was talking about John, okay? He said, well, old John and me used to go a pile of hunting, trapping, and fishing in back of the 1860s. And we about as chummy as a white man and an Indian ever got. We had a cabin up in the bush about a mile west of the old Indian reservation. One night, I don't remember the most thing, except it was late fall. They were looking around and they settled a fire, and they were talking about that. They had been in Shakopee and was chock full of fire, water, and fights. He rummaged around and got some grub, then he lit his pipe and lay down on the bunk. He told him that the Ojibwa had been to Shakopee and there was a fight, and Ojibwa woman had stolen a Dakota woman. And then he said that he had a woman who was Catholic and was a sweetheart with John. So he said, well, I guess he might get married. Wasn't a problem for her if they got married or not, but he said, okay, go ahead, John, yes, that's what we need to do. So the next morning, we went back to Shakopee. They moved up to Fish Lake, leaving the cabin empty. About a week afterwards, they were at the fishing. Okay, I told her to go to the shack. There was a bull snake inside. They examined it for a while, and then inside them was an air purse. It was one of those hitching certificates. One of them says when they get hitched with a gal. In other words, his certificate of marriage was there in the purse. Okay? I made up the names, John Lucin and Annie Iron Toe Ellen. And the next year, I went out there, found John and his wife living together. After they quieted down, he said, Black Coat married me and Ann. And they put him to paper, and the pale-faced chef put it in the skin of the snake. He took the canoe across the lake. They dropped it in the water, and that was all that they got. So that's where the was. And it's a great story. They said it may have been true, but they said there's a good possibility that they exaggerated a lot. And it's just interesting because that's John in the middle there with all his family too. It's just kind of a cool picture. Eventually moved to Redwood County, and they died in 1904. He was 69 years old. And of course, Ann went to South Dakota, died in 1910. She was 80 years old. Now the last one we got to say quick before we get out is the rat tail bounty from the 1930s to the 1950s.
What was that?
And this is a true story. In fact, Willie, who's not here today, William Ryan talks about the river rats in the 1950s. His wife also talks the same story about this. Okay. At that time in the 1950s, they do a lot of hunting, fishing, trapping, okay? And also they used to have guns, and they go around the Minnesota river bottoms in and around Shakopee. During the Great Depression, for several years after, river rats invaded downtown Shakopee. And that is true, okay? Partly because they didn't have a place to put the garbage. It just was all over the place. So the city of Shakopee decided that if children want to kill the rats and bring them to City Hall, which is on 2nd Avenue, they would get 5 cents per rat. And this is true, okay? So they wandered around the Minnesota river bed. They didn't have a lot of money, so of course the bounty was great. That's where they got some money. So the rats were maintained at City on 2nd Avenue by the old City Hall and the hotel. They had to kill the varmint and give it to the city to get the reward. So they bring up the rats and gave it to them. They got the money, okay? Just an interesting thing. So meanwhile, the city couldn't stand all the rats. So they asked, finally, they said, okay, from now on, we're just going to cut off the tail and just bring the tail, and that's it. So they would go to the hardware downtown, buy the shotgun ammo. It was 50 cents per row. So they used to, because of this depression, they couldn't get the whole thing. They just get a row of them each time. The kids would, right? And then they go one at a time. They buy them. Okay. The kids would buy a row, hunt there, get the rats, And then they used that sometimes to help the family survive actually during the Depression. Okay. By 1945, the Rodent Fund offered a bounty of 10 cents per rats. Okay. And of course, the people in the city didn't like it because they had these dead rat tails, right? So they would take them and put them in the alley outside in garbage cans. Well, what would you do if you were a kid? If you're smart, you wait around, go afterwards, take them and bring it in and get some money. Which is what they did. They were smart. They knew that if they waited a few minutes, they could step there, get the back, and then they do it again and get the money again. In fact, what they said is though, they always said we'd only do it twice on each thing. They limited, right? But they still get 20 cents for each time, okay? And so, in fact, there's articles, or they talk about often the rats, and what happened is that they did it so often, and people would go to the dump, which was what now is the landing area in Memorial Park, just close to that area. That's where the jump thing, and they would shoot the rats, okay? Willie loves shooting rats. He realized that eventually they've been doing it so much that there was very few rats in Shakopee at all. Okay? So he thought a little bit, and then he said, if I go to Chaska, okay, he could go shot some rats, then he could return them to Shakopee and get the reward. And that's what he did. He did that over and over until the workers in Shakopee noticed that the rat tails were from Chaska, not Shakopee. So the city decided to stop paying for the rats. Isn't that's a great, it's a great story, and all of it is true. And there are people, like I said, he's not here, but Willie's here often, and he talks about the whole thing. He remembers the whole process, what they did. And of course, we always called Chaska the river rats. And the people in Chaska used to call Shakopee river rats. But we got rid of the rats. I don't know what happened in Chaska. That's up to you guys to decide. So anyway, so just so you know, again, if you go online, there's the thing. These are all the ones we talked about today. And each of them are brochures on each of those. So you can print them out, or you can just read them, or whatever. But these are all the people that we just talked about today in the thing, just so you know. Okay?
Wonderful.
Now, just to know what's coming up, there's a cultural fest on Friday from, I think it's, 5:30 to 9 at the high school. They do different shows of food. There's food there. We'll have a booth there at the Shakopee Heritage Society, so feel free to stop by. It's free. Coming up, Glory Hallelujah about church, mosques, and other holy places on April 8th. Then the Bricks, that's in May 13th. And then the other one's coming up is the Good of the Woman, the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee. That one will be at the Scott County Historical Society on Thursday, May 29th, 5 to 6:30 p.m. on that one. The other ones that are 1 to 2, but that one is specifically that one there. And I think they're all free, or they all are free. Okay. And let's see. Just so you know, we have the cemetery tours coming up, starting in May 17th. Each of these are at the 4 cemeteries. Now I'm guessing we're going to run out of them. But that's the perfect timing anyway. All right, so anyway, if you have information, there is actually a brochure that has the cemetery tours there. And the only other thing is that the